This man has been firing steam engines for 55 years. What makes him unique is that he worked on all the main British steam express locomotives. And this is his story. Half a century ago, every schoolboy wanted to be an engine driver. There were cinema newsreels devoted to their exploits. Men like Ernest Potter, who drove the Royal Scot, were working-class heroes, the real-life action men of their age.
The train gathers speed. Potter has behind him a 450-ton train carrying possibly some 800 passengers. In front of him is 200 miles of track, uphill, downhill, round curves and through stations, junctions and tunnels, past countless signals. Potter will unerringly take his trainload of passengers.
It was heady stuff, enough to make one 15-year-old abandon his place at art school for a chance to work on the engines. It was the beginning of a lifelong love affair.
I think engines attracted a boy like myself by the sheer drama and theatre of their operation. Now, my family wasn't railway, but my school backed onto the railway line. The house I lived in backed onto the railway line, and it just stirred me to the root of my soul to hear engines working hard at night and in the day.
Clive Groome got a job at the grimy freight shed at Norwood Junction. One of the drivers there was a mad-keen photographer.
I was in a lowly shunting gang at Norwood with a driver called Bob Henderson. And Bob Henderson was an amateur photographer, so he always had a camera with him. And the reason that picture exists is because Bob had his camera with him as usual and took a picture of me at the end of a day's, or rather night's, work. We'd been down to East Croydon station, and at that time the station had a large shunting yard. And this Vulcan, or C2X as it was used on the shunting all night long. And that was the first time that I'd ever shunted. So I'm standing in that picture on the driver's side of the engine, feeling extremely pleased with myself, with the dirty old serge jacket on that I'd picked up from a rubbish heap, because you didn't get a serge jacket issued to you until you'd done 287 firing turns. But I'd found this serge jacket in a rubbish heap, picked it up and put it on because it made me look more like an engine man. And that's what you see, a greasy old serge jacket on a rather skinny lad looking extremely pleased with himself.
Like all the lads at the engine sheds, Clive started as a cleaner.
Come on, boy. Have you got your own book? Yes, sir. You know what to do with it? Yes, sir. Learn it. That's right, learn it.
The engine cleaners were like artful dodgers, capering around in their greasy overalls, soaked through to the skin with paraffin, throwing wads of paraffin soaked rag at each other, setting light to braziers by throwing paraffin into it by the cupful. Totally harum-scarum sort of society, with the cleaners foreman trying desperately to keep them all in order.
Better get on the chimney, young Harry.
Right.
Outside and inside, mind.
They played practical jokes, like making a newcomer clean inside the chimney.
I loved it. I really loved it. It was just the sort of thing a 16 or 15-year-old boy would love. The people were daunting to me. They all looked extremely rough and tough, and I subsequently found out that they were quite normal, nice, humane and people.
But Clive didn't join to be a cleaner. His heart was set on becoming an engineman.
The few occasions when I was invited onto the footplate impressed me by the feeling, the smell. A good driver would always wipe the boiler down with engine oil to make it look shiny and smart. And the smell of that engine oil is something that really gets into you when you get onto an engine. I was amazed that the whole thing shook and rumbled so much when it actually ran. It wasn't half as smooth as it looked as it went by. Bitten by the bug, certainly. It was a theatrical kind of a bug that I was bitten by.
But Clive Groome's budding career was derailed by national service. Now the only way he could work on steam engines was to hitch a ride on miniature railways like this one at Hastings. And when the army wasn't looking, he'd be talking his way onto the footplate with his friend Bill Hoole, a top link driver on the LNER. Bill was a speed merchant, and he and his mates helped to give Clive a new confidence that shows in this picture after demob. The boys become a man, and they nicknamed him Sergeant Major Groome. This is the day he took his driving test on one of the Lord Nelson Express engines. Clive's mentor was the southern driver Len Rickard on expresses like the Bournemouth Belle. And 50 years after firing this engine, 35005 Canadian Pacific, Clive is to spend a day firing the very same engine, which takes him back.
You get to the age where you can be considered to be a fireman. They give you a test on the rules of a fireman. After you've had the test, you're then liable to be upgraded from cleaner to a fireman. Eventually the great day comes, and the foreman comes into the cleaner's lobby and says, Groome, you're out on such and such a duty with driver so-and-so. And you think, yippee, this is my great chance. But, you know, it's a terrible thing really, because you don't know what you're doing. You're going from one disaster to another, and at the end of it you usually feel that you'll never make a fireman in a million years.
He now wanted to explore the engines of Britain's other 3 railway regions.
As a southern man, I had no entitlement to ride on anybody else's engine without official approval. But I did know Bill Hoole, who was a King's Cross driver. And through personal acquaintanceship with him, and at his invitation, I used to ride with him to Newcastle, Grantham, and so on the night sleeper to Newcastle. That was very, very interesting, and it's very good for your confidence to get experience on other locomotives, longer lines. I mean, we did 100 miles to Bournemouth and back, 200 miles for a day's work. We thought we were heroes. They did 300 miles in a straight line. And the LMS did Crewe, and then Crewe to Glasgow.
The 4 regions each had a frontline express engine. This is the Great Western Region's King class engine. It made non-stop trips to Plymouth with the Cornish Riviera Express, and Clive Groome was determined to ride there on the footplate. And this is the flagship of the London and North Eastern region, the A4 locomotive class. Bill Hoole drove these, and one of the class holds the world speed record for a steam engine. Clive Groome was itching to fire them. The Southern region's main express engine was the Merchant Navy class. Clive moved to Nine Elms Shed outside Waterloo so he could work on them, and this became his yardstick for measuring other engines. How would the Merchant Navy locomotives measure up against the legendary red engines of the London, Midland and Scottish region? like this Coronation Pacific designed by Stanier for the heavy West Coast expresses to Glasgow. To find out, Clive would have to negotiate some railway politics.
I wrote to this character, a very high up official, and said, could I have a footplate pass to ride from London to Carlisle? And they sent back, via my shedmaster, who told me off for going over his head without going through him, that they'd given me the pass. I got a little reprimand and a pass. And that's how I got the thing going. And I did the same then with the Western region through my shedmaster. I was a good boy after that. I knew the ropes. And I used to go through my shedmaster, through the official on the other side and get a permit. And being a footplate man myself, they didn't have to put an inspector with me to keep me from interfering with the crew at the inopportune moments. So it was just the three of us on the footplate.
The stage was set to compare Southern Express engines against their Western counterparts, to find out if the Midland locomotives were better than their LNER rivals. As a Southern engineman, Clive Groome was working on the most modern locomotives in the country. Their designer, Bulleid, gave the fireman a firing plate well off the floor so he didn't have to bend double to reach the coal. And the engines had a cab that kept out the elements. Hot in the summer maybe, but a great place to be on a winter's day. He was about to experience the culture shock of working on the most archaic express locos in the country. The magnificent old engines of the Great Western Railway could trace their roots right back to the Victorian age, when the driver's tie would be flapping in the breeze as he headed west from Paddington. This engine, City of Truro, was still at work when Clive Groome was a young man. He could remember looking across at the Great Western engines with something approaching pity.
We used to stand at Basingstoke, just in terms of comfort. We used to stand at Basingstoke with a driving rain, which it rains awfully heavily at Basingstoke. It's a high place and the weather is very often dreadful there. We'd sit on our engine with the windows shut, our backs against a screen, our feet up on the boiler, a cup of tea resting on a big flat oil receptacle, and we'd look across the yard at a Western engine with their little short roof, tip-up seats, no back to the cab, and they'd be in Macintoshes with the rain running into their boots. And we'd be with electric lights, the generator humming, almost like a spaceship compared to a sailing boat.
He learned to love these sailing ships on wheels, for the GWR engines were magic machines. The driver was on the wrong side. The whole thing was open to the elements, and the fireman was bent double. So first impressions of the Great Western were not very favourable for a young fireman from the Southern. And yet these machines were loved by their crews. Clive Groome came to love them too, though he never understood the logic of just one water gauge glass. That's the zebra pattern gauge on the left. Most other railways duplicated this key safety equipment.
The Western is a strange railway. It has its own style, but its style is a mixture of America and French. And the Americans only have one gauge glass on even their big boys or any of their huge engines, one gauge glass. They were ahead of everybody in taper boilers, the valve arrangements, the design of controls. They were beautifully put together, and they got a standard that they didn't bother really to proceed any further from. The Western engines are what you might call strong meat. It's poison to some and delightful to others. I think they got the proportions and the methods of working with the engines off to a T quite early on.
A Western fireman was expected to jerk a chain between shovelfuls of coal. It pulled a flap in front of the fire hole to stop cold air getting in. Laborious, but effective.
They respond very, very well to a certain technique, and everybody knew the technique. All the footplates were the same. And you also are inclined to wonder whether the fact that they were an awful lot of miners who probably joined the Western in Wales and who were quite used to shovelling in very low seams, shovelling bent double would be absolutely nothing to them. It probably was heaven because there wasn't a lump of coal above their heads.
But would it be heaven for Mr. Groome? When permission came to ride on the Western, it was for a trip non-stop to Plymouth behind a King-class engine. This machine could produce brute power, but from only a small fire, so it was unforgiving to a bad fireman. And there were steep banks to climb in Devon that needed maximum power just when the fireman was getting tired. The key for Clive Groome was to watch carefully how the regular crew worked their engine.
They had a set of men who were trained to work those engines in the way they had to be worked, and they did it very nicely. It was primitive stuff though.
The Kings had a long and narrow firebox, and Clive noticed how the men built up a big mound of Welsh steam coal in readiness for the journey. His memories of that epic trip 50 years ago are still fresh in his mind.
The memories of the King trip are of it being extremely clean, tidy, well organised. The engine backed onto its train on that curving platform at Paddington, with the driver leaning out as far as he could to see the train. So the engine came back into the station with the safety valves shushing as they do on Western engines. And when they'd stopped and when the hooking up was over, I introduced myself. I'd got a footplate pass to ride with them. And I met this character, Di Lloyd, who was the fireman. And he told me where to stick my coat in the corner of the cab, and I stood out of the way. One thing about being an engineman is that you don't usually stand in the way of people. And the fire had already been made up. I knew that it would be because they burnt Welsh coal the same as we did. And the Welsh coal was built up really high in the box. No excess steam at that time, just a gentle shush at the safety valves. And then the engine was put into 4 gear and off it went. pressure began to drop back, and I thought, uh-oh, because I'd had lots of trips at that point on other railways, and it wasn't only me that had trouble sometimes making steam. It seemed fairly endemic. But what he did, he got the great big heavy dart, the poker device, and he shoved it into the fire under the door, and he gave it a couple of firm lifts up, and that let the air through the fire. And in no time, the fire took a light, and it was well cooked in the middle, and there was no trouble for steam after that. And then I watched him doing this very Great Western thing of shoving that great huge bladed Western shovel deep into the coal, which at that time was fairly far forward in the tender, turning round and pulling on the chain to knock the flat on the floor with a thump, and then he just bopped. And bop is the sound it makes when a Western man throws in a heavy shovelful of coal. They just bop it into the middle of the box. And then he pulled the chain up and turned round and got another shovelful ready. And it was very different from what I'd seen on the North Eastern or the LMS or what we did on our railway, because we fired with smaller shovelfuls of coal. We left the door open and we threw it precisely to places in the box. But with the Western engines, with their long, deep fireboxes and high-pitched brick arches, they could actually fire with a real haycock of a fire in the back 6 feet of the grate. Now they've got 11'6" long grates, those Kings, and you would think that it involved an awful lot of hard work, but it doesn't. The way they fire, it didn't. And I didn't do any firing for miles. I was just watching what was going on. Eventually, when I did get a crack at firing, I found that the rhythm came quite easily. There was no hurry to it. The coal by then was well back into the tender, so you had to walk back a bit into the tender, then come out a bit and turn round and then do the chain down and bop thing. So there was no sort of self-feeding of the coal down an inclined plane as there is on other engines. But nevertheless, it wasn't hard work. I got used to bending over fairly low doing it. And there came a point when he said to me, "All right, Clive, you've thrown in your round, do a bit more. I'll tell you why in a minute." So I threw on a couple of more, say a dozen more shovelfuls, totally unnecessarily, into the middle of the fire, and pulled the flap up and looked at him and sort of, why was that? And he said, "You'll see in a minute." And we burst out of the cliffs. And I found we were running along the seawall at Dawlish, and it was in the summer. And of course the beach was full of girls, and he said, "You wouldn't have wanted to miss that, would you?" And that's what it was all about. They used to stoke the fire up so that they could lean out of the cab side a bit and watch the view. I wasn't tired. The vibration hadn't been bad on the engine. We weren't dirty. And they took the engine off to the shed. And we'd arranged to meet in the LNER Arms, which wasn't far from the engine shed. So I got washed up and went back there that evening to meet them. And the place was full of enginemen, mostly Welsh. And after about half an hour of drinking, they began to sing, totally uninhibited. The only time I've heard anything like it was in an Irish pub in Wimbledon. And this was, I might say, better singing. And they were all singing. It was really, really nice. And the evening passed very, very quickly. The next day I met them again quite early with a bit of a sore head, and they had a castle to work the up train. Fairly light load at first, fairly stiff bank to get over. I remember seeing the crest of the bank ahead of us and the engine waggling from side to side as it hauled itself up over the top. We then picked up some more coaches and ran on up to London. And the trip again went very nicely. The castle didn't seem to be any less of an engine than a king. The tender rode so smoothly that standing in the tender and watching the two guys at their work, you could have been in a coach, because there was none of the shouldering of the pistons as you get from the engine footplate. When you stand on the tender, it really is smooth. And I couldn't help looking around and thinking, yeah, they really got it really off to a T. Because I've never, at that point, prepared a Western engine. They're wonderful to run on, they're wonderful to fire, they're very good to drive, not too good at buffering up with the long reach to the brake handle. But when you get to prepare them, they are a nightmare.
Having fired the kings and castles, Clive Groome was now in a position to compare the great Western machines with some very different engines. This is Flying Scotsman, the most famous of Sir Nigel Gresley's engines that worked the LNER expresses between King's Cross and Edinburgh. These machines were built on a completely different philosophy. A wider grate, 3 cylinders instead of 4, and a cab that was designed for comfort as well as speed. The crew had upholstered bucket seats, and the firemen worked with a small shovel, posting each package of coal through a small letterbox of a firehole door. They hadn't been perfect engines when they first came out, but careful development had turned them into powerful, high-speed racehorses.
When they first came out, they weren't any good. When they first came out, they ate coal in relation to the power they produced, because the valves were not big enough and various other bits weren't accurate. A bit of advice from the Western, I believe, cured a lot of the initial problems on the A3s.
But the pick of the bunch were the A4s, sometimes called streaks, of which Mallard was the most famous example. They were probably the most glamorous express engines ever built in Britain, and drivers like Bill Hull would race them across the flat country of eastern England. The streamlining was of doubtful value. Almost everyone else who tried it soon gave up the experiment. But this class of high-wheeled, high-boilered, high-speed locomotives retained their racing outfits to the very end.
The engines were lovely. They were high-boilered, bucket seat for the driver. Very smart-looking machines. I really felt privileged to be up in the cab of those A3s and A4s. They weren't very large engines at all, but they were immensely strong and fast, and they steamed beautifully. I rode several times on A4s, and I was very impressed by them. The small amount of fire you could carry in the box and still make steam actually shocked me. Leaving King's Cross with about 14 coaches on, or 15 coaches, the fire would only just be covering the bars. The boiler would only be a third of a glass full. They'd set out from King's Cross with the fire dancing on the grate, As they went into the tunnel, they'd whack on the exhaust injector and it would be left on, and it would just feed the boiler at the same rate that the water was evaporating, and the water was always around half a glass, and the fire was always dancing on the bars. And I was most impressed. The crews ran their engines with the minimum of fire on the grate, something I'd never seen before, a dancing firebed, even with a 14-coach train, pulling up through Potter's Bar, up the hill out of King's Cross. The injectors made a terrific racket, and they were put on almost as soon as you got into the tunnel, because they set off with a third of a glass of water, and they set the injectors so that it stayed a third all the time, with enough water going in to replace the water that was being evaporated. And then they just fired with their very small, spoon-sized, long-handled shovel through that small oven door flap. I had a go at it too, and I could do it all right. It was not too bad. Bending down a bit low for the shovel plate, it wasn't as high as ours on the Southern. The coal was quite large slabs of hard coal, and sometimes you had to wangle it through the door and whack it round the back corners. Other times you had the smaller stuff. But you soon got into the hang of it. The engines rode beautifully, and Bill, he was a cracking driver, not to everybody's taste, because he was a bit of a basher and he would go like hell to make up time. What he would do, he'd drive his fireman so far, and he'd turn around to me and say, the engine's not steaming very well at the moment, but when he loses his temper, you watch. And the fireman would lose his temper, and he'd probably cursing under his breath, old Bill. And in his temper, he'd throw the coal in every direction very, very fast, and the engine would start to steam again. And then Bill would have a go. He'd say to the fireman, okay, you sit up there and drive for a bit and I'll fire. So he wasn't afraid of doing the work himself either. And he wasn't young. And, you know, I just was very impressed by the whole thing. And of course the line was long, a lot longer than the Southern. We were just a backyard railway.
Clive Groome became aware that so much depends on the kind of coal an engine's burning. The Southern and Western used soft Welsh coal, which swells into a solid mass but doesn't burn with a long flame, and is at its best in a thick bed, built up under the firehole door. It was different though on the Eastern region. The A4s burnt hard coal, which burns with a longer flame and can be laid as a thinner blanket in the firebox.
When you burn hard coal, it's the length of the flame that gives you your heat. When you're burning soft coal, it's the depth of the fire that gives you your heat. So there is a difference. The Western always carried a very deep fire. We carried a deep fire when we were burning Welsh coal. In the days when 9Ls was issued with hard coal, you could probably have run with a shallower fire.
So were the Eastern locos speedier than Southern engines?
The Eastern Pacifics have got a feeling of lightness about them. They definitely have. They are racehorses. Compared to a Bulleid is a bit clunky, especially in the rebuilt condition. When they were unrebuilt, they were fairly fast and free, but they didn't look like racehorses. They looked like suitcases on wheels. They didn't feel anything like the race horses of the Northeastern.
Of course, a worn-out engine of any class is a bad engine.
Well, it changes in water and coal consumption. The more leaks there are, the more water it uses, the less efficiently it uses the steam. The harder you've got to work it to get the same power out of it. The rougher it rides, the more the coal flies off the tender into the footplate, and so on. So it's a general depreciation of gait and wind and power. Like a horse, it becomes knackered. The vibration through your feet knackers the fireman and driver. So everybody gets tired, including the engine.
Clive Groome's journeys on these engines were to change his philosophy of firing and make him a better engineman. His next adventure was aboard a direct competitor of the famous A4s. While the A4s ruled the east coast to Edinburgh, the route to Glasgow was the territory of these magnificent railway engines, the Duchess Pacifics designed by Sir William Stanier. 50 years ago, this very engine was backing onto the midday Scott at Euston, and Clive Groome would be on the footplate. He knew these engines by reputation.
There's no doubt about it, the Duchesses were an incredible machine. They took the Western idea, and Stanier improved all the Western ideas. They were good ideas, but they had their drawbacks, and Stanier took the drawbacks out of them. He improved the lubrication problems. He set the cab ergonomics right so that drivers could actually reach their controls and look out of the window. All sorts of things like that. The Duchesses were lovely machines. The Princesses were old-fashioned and extraordinarily good machines. I rode on both on the midday Scott. The firebox didn't take as much firing as a Bulleid because the back corners weren't so hard to fill as they are on a Bulleid. They're not so wide. The coal was hard coal. You had to shovel off the floor. That wasn't too much fun. The fall plate between the engine and tender was very humped, so that when it was wet you could easily slip about on the footplate and it was hard to keep your feet. The cab was quite short. There wasn't a lot of protection in the cab. There was no backrest against the wind coming from behind you. The Princess was extremely drafty in the winter. I found it a cold engine, very similar to a Lord Nelson in terms of the primitive nature of its cab. But they were very, very strong. It pulled, I think the Princess that I was on actually pulled 16 coaches the day I was on it, without any fuss at all. That was a startling weight for the Southern. We ran with 13 coaches generally. And there they were with 16, making no effort of it whatsoever. We went over Shap, we had a banker. It was very impressive to set out on a 400-mile journey, and it put our stuff into the shade completely.
The Stanier Pacifics had featured on newsreels when Clive Groome was a little boy.
On June 29th, after a careful running in, the engine Coronation, hauling the Coronation Scott train, was allowed to show her paces. She was in charge of driver Tom Clark and fireman Lewis. 100 journalists and railway officials took part in a test run from Euston to Crewe and back that provided such an orgy of speed as has never before been indulged in over LMS metals. Until nearing Crewe in the down direction, the running, though excellent, was kept to schedule, but at Whitmore, driver Clark let her have the throttle. From 85 miles an hour, the speed rose quickly to 100. Faster yet and faster, eating up the miles. 102, 105, 108, and she's still accelerating. The rhythm of the exhaust grows stronger, faster. 112.5 miles an hour for 2 miles, smoothly surging over the metals. A supreme effort, and Coronation has done it. 114 miles an hour, the highest speed yet attained in the Empire.
The streamlining was long gone by the time Clive Groome was a railwayman, and so was the ton-up mentality. But he was thrilled to be allowed on the footplate all the way to Glasgow.
The day that I took a trip, my first trip on a Duchess, was it was probably a New Year's Eve, I think. And it was the midday Scott. And I'd got a pass from the appropriate authorities to ride on the footplate. It was the Duchess of Sutherland, the engine's in fact in preservation now. I climbed up onto the footplate and introduced myself to the fellows up there. They were not as smartly dressed as Southern crews were inclined to be, because they were going to go to Crewe. That was their first stop. They were really doing the goods, so they didn't go in for needless bullshit. The footplate was surprisingly small, because the cab floor is quite high up on those engines, and your head is, if you're tall, quite near the roof. In fact, when I stood behind the driver, my head sometimes protruded far enough into the open air to get myself a face full of water and ash from the chimney. The fire bed was massively built up in the back of the box, with huge lumps of hard coal, which spat and crackled like a fish and chip shop at full pelt. The coal was spilling out of the door, the blower was on, the pressure was up, the water was in the top of the glass, the doors were closed, the fireman looked out, said right away, the driver blew the hooter, pulled on the bloody great long regulator, and away she went. And the engine was giving 2 beats on every, 2 cylinderfuls on every beat, so there was quite a whack coming out the chimney. 4-cylinder engine, double beats on every of the 4 beats, and away we went. The fireman opened the door up and started shoveling the coal in on top of what was already in there. With not a very large shovel, but a smaller handled one than they used on the northeastern. So an LMS shovel is like a northeastern shovel, slightly truncated. And he was whacking the coal into the back corners and down the front. And what I noticed was that the back corners of a Duchess aren't as wide as the back corners on a merchant navy. So he didn't have to swing the shovel quite so in such an exaggerated movement to get the coal from either side to the other. They're slightly trapezoid in their shape. Longer though than a merchant navy. And away we went. The engine wasn't in very good nick. The engine was priming for a start. Now when an engine primes, it gathers the water out of the boiler and throws some of it out the chimney. And that was causing them trouble for some time. But the fireman got the water level a bit lower and away we went. At one point, I remember, they said to me, Clive, stand in the corner of the cab away from the fire door. And what it was, they were going through a very narrow bored tunnel. I can't think of the name of it now, but it's quite well known. And recently a man was burnt there because he was actually firing going through the tunnel, which was an absolute no-no. They put the blower on full to get the most draft they could on the chimney to draw the fire forward, even though the regulator was already open. They shut the fire doors up tight. The driver stood in his corner. The fireman and I stood in the fireman's corner, and we went whoop into that thing at high speed. And I was told that the cab would have filled with flame had the door been open or the blower not been full on. It was just like pushing a cork into a bottle, that engine throwing itself into that tunnel.
What stuck in his mind was the distances these trains covered. 4 times as far as he'd travel on a Southern Express, and through much tougher countryside.
I admire anybody who sets out on some of them, they did do non-stops to Glasgow. Very occasionally there was a non-stop run to Glasgow where the fireman could, on a bad day, shift 10 tons of coal. On a good day, probably 8 tons of coal. And that's some going. You know, you burn about a ton for every 50 miles.
At Crewe, there was an engine change, and Clive found himself on the older Princess type of engine, a huge machine whose Great Western ancestry could be seen at a glance. The designer had worked for the GWR, so the Princess was like a King, only bigger. But where the King's firebox was carried between the driving wheels, on the Princess an extra pair of carrying wheels under the cab allowed for a bigger, wider firebox. This had been Stanier's first attempt at a top-line express engine, and it was a full 15 tons heavier than a King. In fact, the Princess had the longest fixed wheelbase of any British express locomotive. Even the controls seemed giant-sized. The regulator was a long slab of iron, which suggested that this heavy machine really meant business. Clive Groome remembers the changeover at Crewe.
Another engine came on with 2 more coaches, and the next engine was a Princess, an older-fashioned engine. So now we had 16 on. We'd had 14 on from Euston. We now had 16 on. Now on my own railway, 13 was a fair load, and we only went 100 miles. This fellow was going to go through to Glasgow now with 16. And away we went again. And I noticed immediately that the engine was draftier than the other engine. It was more old-fashioned, more Great Western in its appearance. On both engines, the shovelling position was quite low. The tender was massive, 10 tons of coal. Our engines only carried 6, 7 tons of coal. They carried 10. I had a go at shovelling. It was low to get down to. The fall plate was split in 2 halves. It was a bit humped, so you could slip on it quite easily. There was such a gradient on it because of the hump that you could slip rather easily doing it. But I managed to fire it okay. They had a terrible trip going up over the final bank just before Carlisle. Terrible trip. They were back on steam. The water was low. The protector ring of the firebox had got dislodged and fallen into the firebox. That's a lump of iron, you know, about something like 20 pounds in weight. The baffle plate, which is held in by the protector ring, then fell into the fire as well. So now you've got 2 lumps of metal in the fire amongst all the coal and clinker. The fireman was having a real struggle. We stopped when we got to the top of the bank, and the driver examined the engine because he said he'd thought he heard some groaning in the valve gear. and then we proceeded on down to Carlisle, making up the water level in the boiler while we did. So it was an epic trip. We were an hour late by then, and when we got to Glasgow, I'd spent 9 hours on the footplate. 9 continuous hours on 2 engines, and we'd done 400 miles, and I hadn't done much of the work, but I was knackered and I was black with coal dust, and it had been a hell of an insight into what real locomotive work could be. And I never really was frightened after that at anything the Southern threw at me.
So the southern region didn't seem scary anymore, even when Clive went on to drive the big merchant navy expresses from Waterloo. 50 years later, he still drove the massive machines with fingertip precision, exuding that calmness of the true professional. He was back on Canadian Pacific after nearly 40 years' absence, and it seemed like only yesterday.
What a lovely afternoon, eh? I couldn't think of a better way. Beautiful. Nice way to travel, eh?
Clive sees himself as a successor to the Georgian coachman, with the team of horses replaced by a living, breathing machine.
There's life in it. It's like a mechanical horse. I mean, kids, I'm sure, used to want to be coach drivers. It's something that comes from the unknown, passes through your life and disappears again, and somebody's in charge of it, and you envy them. One, because they know something about the outside world that you don't, and two, they're controlling something which makes a lot of clatter and noise and rhythm. Coach drivers were always waved at by the kids of the village. Engine drivers were always waved at.
Merchant navies are so cool compared, using it's hot here, but it's not hot compared to what they were like originally. You think we can't see out the window, but you couldn't see anything out the window the way they were originally. But they are a bit chonky the way they run now. The old engines didn't make all this clonk, 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 clonk noise. They went along pretty silently. So we did notice that. But the firemen certainly liked having a cooler footplate. Because it was bloody hot for them in those days.
Give any self-respecting engineman the chance and he'll swap places with the fireman, because firing's more of a challenge. The thing to watch is the way the shovel flicks coal in different directions. The fireman keeps a picture in his mind of the state of the fire and directs coal accordingly. And the trick is to prevent it thinning out anywhere, which would let cold air rush in from underneath. Ask any experienced engineman which job he'd rather do, driving or firing, and the answer is predictable.
firing. Firing's the best of the two jobs.
Why do professional enginemen say that?
I think they all fancy themselves as shovel men, you know, and anybody can drive an engine. There's nothing to that. The firing is the tricky bit.
When originally built, Bulleid's Southern Express engines looked like this, box-shaped like a carriage, but there were too many doubtful innovations, and many of the engines were rebuilt along conventional lines. But it didn't change their performance from a footplate point of view as much as you might expect.
The water consumption and coal consumption on a rebuild, I don't think was any different. Not in my view, because a rebuild didn't run as freely as an unrebuilt. When you coasted, they didn't coast as far without steam as an unrebuilt. They were less smooth to ride on because the springing was firmed up a bit. But they were undoubtedly cooler, better looking, and when the unrebuilts got run down, we were quite pleased to see them converted.
These machines had a reputation for losing their footing and going into a slip.
Now a good driver will watch that like a hawk. He won't just open the regulator and leave it, because the engine will slip then. Now remember that the engines the drivers that took over those Bulleids when they were built in the 40s had been driving King Arthurs mostly. There was only 16 Nelsons. And those King Arthurs were as heavy as lead and practically never slipped whatever you did to them. And then they were suddenly faced with this rather complex machine, full of gauges, with a steam reverser that frightened them to death, 280 pounds pressure, and a regulator that had no real first valve to it. Okay, now most regulators have quite a large first valve, which you get the engine going under before you hit the second valve. On a Merchant Navy or a West Country, it's a very quickly opened regulator. And those men weren't used to that. And of course they slipped and slid all over the place when they first came out. They eventually reduced the pressure from 280 to 250, which made a bit of a difference. When you started away, you whacked the regulator open to make the engine jump forward. Once it had jumped forward, you shut the regulator and let the pressure drop until it dropped to about 60, and then you opened it again between 60 and 80 and shut it again, and as long as you kept it floating between 60 and 80, it would pull a train away with not a trace of a slip. And as your speed increased, you increased the steam from 80 to 100 to 150, 160, and you drove it away to a sort of a normal speed at 160, and then you whacked it open as full as you liked after that, and away she went. They were very powerful engines.
This Q1 freight engine from the same designer reveals their greatest strength, the ability to boil water rapidly.
Look at the Q1 as an example. The Q1 has a firebox which is 9 feet long and a boiler which is 11 feet long, a barrel, half and half. Bulleid Pacifics have a firebox and combustion chamber which is almost as long as the boiler barrel. So Bulleid had got the idea absolutely perfectly. It's the firebox and the ability to boil water that's the important thing, not the length of the boiler. And his boilers definitely boil water. It's a very wide grate. It's got a terrific distribution of air over the fire bars. I've fired A4s, I've fired Princess, Duchess, I've fired Bulleids. And the Bulleids burn more coal in the back corners than either of the other types because they have more air given to the back corners of the firebox. A Bulleid ashband goes straight up in a straight line to the back corners of the firebox. None of the others do. They're all constricted one way or another to the back corners of the firebox. The Bulleid back corners are almost square. The tapering of a Duchess means that you don't have to throw the coal very far on the back corners of a Duchess or a Princess. So you've got all that extra footage of heating area at the back of a boiler on a Bulleid.
Clive Groome believes the Great Western kings and castles, for all their many merits, weren't in the same league as the Bulleids when it came to sustained power production. A king needed the right coal and expert handling. It simply didn't have the great area of its younger cousin, so it was hard to compare the two different types.
Well, I mean, I wouldn't compare them. Bulleid is in a class on its own. I wouldn't say that a king could compete with a Bulleid. I think a castle was a better engine for its size than a king was for its size. I don't think the king was such a great advance over a castle at all.
But the Stanier Duchess was a different proposition.
The Bulleids are only a 3-cylinder engine, so they haven't got the power of a Duchess. The firebox of a Bulleid is an incredibly efficient coal burner, and I don't think that any engine exceeded the Bulleids in production of steam. The Duchesses were certainly magnificent machines.
So which of the big four crews were at the top of the tree?
Well, I don't think the king had a bad job at all. Most of their line is level until you get down into the Devon areas. The LMS, I think, probably had the toughest road. The LNER had the fastest road, so they could do the speed records down Stoke and so on. There wasn't that sort of place on the Southern or on the LMS.
And which crew had earned their money?
They're all good. Every one of them. Yeah, they're all good.
Looking back on a lifetime with engines, Clive Groome believes he was a lucky man. Lucky to be part of the railway family which reached into every corner of the land. There was pride in the job, and it could be seen even in the quietest corners of the system. For some people, even allowing for the inevitable nostalgia, this was a quieter, simpler and better world.
It's an old society of Britain's industrial age, where people had friendly societies for getting money. They had equitable societies. They had working men's institutes. You look back to that age, my God, it's a better age. The cleaner would become a fireman. The fireman would become a driver. The driver looked after the fireman because he had been a fireman once himself. The driver taught the fireman all the tricks he could. The fireman taught the cleaner all the tricks he could. You ran improvement classes unpaid in your spare time so that when the exams came up, nobody would fail. Everybody did their bit. The signalman would keep his box sparkling and bright and the buckets clean. The porters would keep the platforms done nicely and the windows clean. Everybody worked together. Almost every family had a rowerman in it somewhere, and many had a great number of rowermen in their family. And the boys of the family heard the discussions around the table of this trip or that trip, of this misdemeanour or that misdemeanour. And they got to understand the ethics of working for the railway.
Coming number 19.
2 returns, please.
£1.80, please.
Clapham Junction, please. What time?
Every 4 minutes.
Thank you.
And the public had a different relationship with railways. They were run as a service and not just as a way of taking as much cash off people as possible. Many more destinations were served, staving off the need for the motor car. That was before the little branch lines were axed. It was a world where small boys collected numbers and little old ladies searched for their brolly.
Good morning. Can you help me, please? I've lost my umbrella.
Yeah.
I left it on the 3:15 train from Alton.
From Alton?
Yes.
Yesterday?
Yes.
And what colour?
A brown one. Has a cover on it.
Has a cover on it?
Yes. It's got a round curly top.
It seems such a long time ago that men like Clive Groome worked the big ocean expresses from Southampton docks. And yet, the steam engine didn't disappear. In fact, a new generation of 21st century railwaymen are now learning the ropes, and Clive has become a teacher. Among his footplate apprentices are 3 of his 4 daughters. These young women are all qualified to be on the footplate.
We are a united little family here, right down to the dog. That dog is an amazing little thing. It's a Yorkshire Terrier, traditionally quite nervy, jumpy little brutes. It's totally phlegmatic about steam engines.
They usually work on the Bluebell Railway, but today they've come to Llangollen, another of the railways where Clive's Footplate Days and Ways organisation trains railway volunteers. Today's engine is a Great Western Manor, a junior relative of the mighty kings that once worked the Cornish Riviera Express. Clive's daughters are working their way up towards the day when they too will be qualified drivers. Their dad knows he's had a good run for his money. Many of his old mates are gone, but perhaps he'll be welcomed as a qualified fireman even after he reaches the end of the line.
Unless there's a steam engine in heaven, and I think really there's unlikely to be steam engines in heaven, although most of my mates might be up there. We can talk about steam engines if I get there. If I go the other way, I shall be an expert in firing the fires, and I'll probably be senior fireman in hell, you know, and that might be a good job, I don't know.